Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teatro Politico in Italian American Theater. As you know, this series is dedicated to Leonardo Sciascia. 2021 is the 100th anniversary of his birth, and I love Leonardo Sciascia, and so I am very happy to do this series. First of all, I hope everyone is fine. Today is a beautiful day in New York, and I want to tell you that we have special guests, and we are going to work backwards somehow. So we are going to have our friend that you know very well, Frank Jayavela, talking about the Teatro Politico in Italian American Theater from the 40s on. And then we are going to have Marcella Bencivenni, who is going to talk about the Teatro Politico in Italian American Theater from the end of 1800 to more or less the 40s. So let me call here my dear friend, Frank Jayavela. Frank, are you there? Oh, here.
Ciao, Laura.
Hello. Thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you. So let me introduce you. For the very few who don't know Frank Jayavela just wrote and directed the short narrative film Fig Jam. He's the recipient of a 2019 International Writers Residency at Arte Studio Ginestrelle in Assisi, Italy, a 2018 Bogliasco Foundation Fellowship, a 2016 Helen Wurlitzer Residency Grant, and a 2015 New Jersey State Arts Council Fellowship Award. Frank's feature-length screenplay, Consent, Lourdes, Screw the Cow, Fig Jam, and Multitasking have won 13 awards and are finalists in over 80 recent...
Actually 100 now.
100, wow, 100 festivals and contests worldwide. He has written numerous plays, including Vatican Falls, 2021 O'Neill semifinalist, Lourdes, 2018 O'Neill semifinalist, produced in New York City and Rome, Consent, twice O'Neill semifinalist, and then, the next is that you win, Orville Station, Mad, Unhinging, and most recently, Lockdown 2021. I wonder what it's about. Frank proudly served on the advisory board festival committee for the In Scena Italian Theater Festival that you may know, produced by Kairos Italy Theater that you may know, in New York City in 2013, 14, and 17. He's a proud member of a Dramatists Guild. He's a dear friend and a fantastic lecturer, speaker about everything, but it's, as an Italian American and a political person, is very important that we have him today. So, Frank, I am going to be here, but I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to be on video, but on mute. And then when you tell me, I'll put the PowerPoint. And if there is any technical problem, we are online. We are doing this. Mm-hmm. You are with us.
Yes. Not a problem. Just look for the wave.
Okay, I'll look for the wave.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of speaking about LGBTQ Italian American theater. In order to do it justice, I broke it down and examined both queer American theater and Italian American theater, and then I listed the very few times those twains actually met. In doing the research for this discussion, I incredulously discovered that the most well-known Italian-American plays that were politically and or socially relevant during the post-World War II era were not written by Italian-Americans or even Italians. More on that later. I want to also mention that while my presentation is about political Italian-American theater, I add socially relevant, since the definition of political can and should be expanded to include theater that is less overtly political, but ground shifting nonetheless. A quick note that there is a distinction to be made, as I found that certain renowned Italian-American playwrights, like Robert Marasco, Frank Galati, William Mastrosimone, Don DeLillo, to just name a few, were not writing about the Italian-American experience or much of anything politically or socially pertinent, so I won't be speaking about them. Italian-American theater was most popular in the 1930s, as you will learn later, but became less after the war began for obvious reasons. Marcella will speak about pre-World War II theater a bit later. My focus is on World War II and after, but first, a quick word about Italians and fascist Italy. It is well known that the theater policy for the fascist regime aimed at re-educating the population, and particularly the younger generation, by offering them new types of shows that were in line with the new spirit of the times. Authors were encouraged to write plays imbued with fascist sentiments to reach a wider audience. Mussolini himself actually wrote 3 plays. What struck me was that while there are many American films and TV movies made about fascist Italy and Mussolini, and about Italians living during that era, I could not find one American play about Mussolini or that centered on the Italian or Italian-American experience during that time, whether written during that period or afterwards. I'm sure they're out there, but I could not locate one. If anyone knows of any, let me know later. So now I'd like to quickly flash back to 1937 with one of Clifford Odets' most famous plays, Golden Boy, about a young Italian-American, Joe Bonaparte, who dreams of being a musician, but is bullied into boxing instead. The play is about class struggle and how achievement is measured. Joe is a man who is crushed by his need to establish his own identity. He is betrayed by his culture's emphasis on materialism over passion and art. This would set the stage for the depiction of the Italian-American in American drama in the 40s, 50s, and beyond. The original Broadway production of Golden Boy had no Italian-Americans involved at all. Golden Boy was made into a film in 1939, starring that very Italian actor, William Holden. That was sarcasm, by the way. He's not Italian. The 2 most significant Italian-American plays of the 1950s, which were deeply felt social commentaries, were written by Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. Both Italian. Oh, no, wait. They're not Italian. Neither of them are remotely Italian. Although Williams did spend a significant part of his life with an Italian lover, Frank Merlot. The Rose Tattoo, that's you, Lara, by Tennessee Williams, bowed in 1951. Set on the Gulf Coast in a mostly Sicilian-populated village, the play centers on Serafina della Rose, a seamstress who is traumatized by the death of her husband. 3 years later, she discovers his infidelity. This heavily symbolic play focuses on her stormy relationship with her daughter. Williams sought to explore racial and ethnic prejudices that were pervasive in American culture then and now. Back then, Americans seemed to have a love-loathe relationship with Italian Americans, embracing popular artists like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, but disparaging Italian immigrants in their own cities and towns. My father used to tell me stories about how my own grandmother, a Sicilian-born immigrant, would often say about her fellow Italian immigrants, why don't they just go back to their own country? Charming woman she was. The Rose Tattoo was daring in its depiction of middle-aged, devout Catholic woman exploring her sexuality. And it also examined themes about Italian Americans longing for economic security and happiness. The original Broadway production was directed by Daniel Mann and starred Maureen Stapleton, neither of Italian descent. A Broadway revival in 1995 starred Mercedes Ruehl, and a third revival right before lockdown, actually, starred Marissa Tomei, who's an actual Italian American. The play was later adapted into a film starring Anna Magnani. She won the Best Actress Academy Award, the first Italian to ever achieve that honor. The other significant work is A View from the Bridge, written by Arthur Miller in 1955. Set in an Italian-American neighborhood in Red Hook, Brooklyn, the play addressed corruption along the docks as well as secrets in a Sicilian family. Imagine. The drama deals with themes such as honor, pride, betrayal, immigration, and dabbles in such taboo subjects as homosexuality and incest. As with his play, The Crucible, Miller was writing at the height of the McCarthy era and in direct response to artists like director Elia Kazan, who named names and in doing so destroyed lives. Miller's protagonist, Eddie, is undone by his own shortcomings. The Broadway production was directed by Martin Ritt and starred Eileen Hecker and Van Heflin, neither Italian. Many revivals have followed, none with Italian directors, but some have had Italian-American leading men like Tony Lobianco and Anthony LaPaglia. Incidentally, a recent production directed by Ivo van Hove had it rain on stage. View was made into a 1962 film directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Ralph Vallone of Calabrian descent, Lara. And I'd like to swiftly mention Irish-American John Patrick Shanley's 1988 play, Italian-American Reconciliation, which, like his screenplay for Moonstruck, dealt with the idea that Italian-American family was what an Italian-American family was like, based on his experiences with his neighbors growing up. It was mostly lighthearted romantic comedy fluff, certainly nothing political. In musical theater, there have been attempts at socially conscious portrayals of Italian and Italian-Americans. The Most Happy Fella, a Frank Loesser musical based on the 1924 Pulitzer Prize-winning stage play They Knew What They Wanted by Sidney Howard, again not Italian, is about an Italian grape farmer who lures a mail-order bride to California under false pretenses. The musical uses broad stereotypes to define its characters. Light in the Piazza in 2003 attempted to be socially conscious, but its Italian-American characters were fairly one-dimensional. The show was based on a 1962 film starring Olivia de Havilland and Rossano Brazzi. Sweet Charity, based on Fellini's Nights of Cabiria, completely strips the show of its Italian origins. The musical Nine, based on Fellini's 8½, presented a Fellini-esque filmmaker having a meltdown funneled through the minds of some very American, very non-Italian writers. Stephen Sondheim's Passion in 1994, based on the 1981 Ettore Scola film Passione d'amore, set during the Risorgimento, was more interesting in telling an operatic and bizarrely unbelievable love story than in being truly about the cultural setting. None of these Tony-winning shows had any major Italian or Italian-Americans involved at the creative level. Fiorello, the Pulitzer Prize-winning musical about Fiorello LaGuardia from 1959, is of course about the famous New York City mayor, but is more a sentimental bio-musical than anything political. One of the creatives happens to be an Italian-American. He was the choreographer Peter Gennaro. I'd like to briefly turn now to an area where peripheral Italian-American characters in American drama seem to thrive as one-dimensional boobs, dunderclods, and truly dastardly beings, the mafia. The African-American playwright Charles Godin's 1969 Pulitzer Prize winner, No Place to Be Somebody, is an example of what so many Italian-Americans would find themselves depicted as in the 1970s on stage, the mobster. Cliché-ridden thugs that would take an added dimension thanks to the films of Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese. A Bronx Tale written by Chaz Palminteri in 1989 would become a 2016 musical, music and lyrics by non-Italians, by the way. It's a potent coming-of-age drama set against a Bronx mafia backdrop. At least in Woody Allen's musical adaptation of his Oscar-winning film Bullets Over Broadway in 2014, the Italian-American mobsters were murderers with hearts of gold. So, finalmente, what Italian-American playwrights were actually writing Italian-American political or socially relevant plays that were at least slightly popular in the post-World War II era? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the 70s and early 80s, beginning with Albert Enorato. His 1973 play Gemini is indeed political in the sense that it dealt with gay themes way before it was popular to do so. Gemini also examines the class struggle in an Italian-American family. The play had the audacity to advocate acceptance for homosexuality amidst a Catholic Italian-American culture. Enorato would explore similar themes in his play Coming of Age in Soho. The Broadway production was directed by Marshall W. Mason, but did feature Danny Aiello, Robert Picardo, and Anne DeSalvo among its cast. There have been no major revivals of Gemini, but there was a little-seen film made in 1980 with a complete cast of non-Italians, including Rita Moreno. Louis LaRusso II's Mama's Little Angels, written in 1979, dealt with strong ties within the Italian-American family and the roots of the Italian-American. Many of his plays, including his most famous, the Tony-nominated Lamppost Reunion, focused on working-class life. Joe Pintaro explored queer themes within a Brooklyn Italian-American familial dynamic in his play Snow Orchid in 1982. In that play, an agoraphobic St. Anthony-obsessed mother smothers her closeted gay son. The piece further examines a tumultuous father-son relationship that borders on the incestuous. A 2015 off-Broadway revival was directed by Valentina Fratti. Pintaro was among the first playwrights to dare write about AIDS, and he dealt with taboo church issues as well. Of course, there have been Italian authors who wrote political plays that were then translated into stage versions in the United States. Chief among those were works by Luigi Pirandello, Edoardo Di Filippo, Carlo Goldoni, Dacia Mariani, and Franca Rame, as well as Dario Fo. I'm going to single out Fo because I had the great good fortune to see a production of his brilliant play, The Accidental Death of an Anarchist, on Broadway when I was in high school in 1984. The production starred Jonathan Pryce and featured Patti LuPone. The play was originally written in 1970, right after the Piazza Fontana bombing in Milano. It's about as political as they come, with insane social satire, specifically targeting police corruption, so it's even timely today. I remember laughing my ass off. The play closed after 2 weeks. It's interesting to note that Fo was seen as too much of a threat to the United States and could not get a visa until a few weeks before the Broadway opening. The American translation that ran on Broadway was written by Richard Nelson, who is, say it with me, not an Italian. Most of the New York Times negative review focused on how Nelson ruined the work, and it was this review that basically killed the run. The staging of Franca Rame and her work, along with her husband Fo, would reveal quite a bit about the American culture when their political plays were translated for an American audience. Too often, the potency would be dissipated in favor of a more superficial, commercially viable translation. The last 30 years haven't really produced a politically or socially significant Italian-American theatrical work. I know that feels like a bold statement, and please contradict me when I'm done, if you can. Certainly, there have been some forgettable comedies that were written more to exploit the American public's view of Italian Americans as superficial, uneducated, Jersey Shore, bridge and tunnel crowd type people, you know? Or, hey, yo, how you doing, dimwits, like Stallone showed us in Rocky. I did find a few slightly notable titles. Blood Type Ragu by Frank Ingrasciota in 2010, Charles Messina wrote a play called A Room of My Own in 2017. And also in 2017, Megan Kennedy, who's not an Italian, wrote Napoli, Brooklyn. But not much else beyond pandering comedies. And I'm not going to mention any big fat titles here. Regarding my own work, I'm currently developing a play that will explore the Italian-American familial experience, including themes of immigration, discrimination, and forced assimilation. And my upcoming play, Vatican Falls, which is a current finalist for the O'Neill, has been over a decade in the making and is certainly political in its depiction of one Italian-American sex abuse survivor's journey. The play was scheduled to world premiere finally last December, but alas, COVID hit, so we're in a holding pattern right now. In my research for this presentation, I found that most of the works about Italian Americans examined a central conflict, the old world versus the new, and trying to figure out where one lives in that space, whether they should assimilate and what assimilation means. Too many too often use broad stereotypes, especially, surprise, non-Italian writing about Italians, but often even Italians fall into a facile manner when depicting their own. In closing, I'd like to remind everyone about the tremendous lack of Italian-American creatives involved in Italian-American theater, let alone those that are politicized. Is this the fault of the producers? That's something to think on. I want to end with 3 questions that I'm throwing out. How many Pulitzer Prize winners centered on Italian-Americans? If you were paying attention, the answer is 2. They Knew What They Wanted and Fiorello, both written by non-Italian-Americans. Now, how many Italian-Americans have been Pulitzer Prize finalists? 1. Her name is Gina Gianfrido, and she's one of a few female Italian-American playwrights who have ever been recognized. She won twice with Becky Shaw in 2009 and with Rapture Blister Burn in 2013. Neither play is about the Italian-American experience, though. Now, my final question to you. How many Italian-American playwrights have won the Pulitzer Prize for drama? Give up? The answer is none, not 1. I'd like to call on all Italian-American playwrights out there to change that pronto. Grazie mille for having me. Thank you, Laura.
Let me do everything. Okay, thank you so much. That was a very nice touch at the end. I forgot to say that if you have a question for Frank or for Marcella, I can put it in the Q&A here at the bottom of the webinar, and so we can answer the questions as they come. Frank, your presentation is always fantastic. I have to tell you, there are some, Marcella is going to talk about this. There are some plays on the Fascist and the Mussolini that were written in America.
By Italian-Americans?
By Italians. Well, yeah, Italians that were here.
Okay.
Were here. Well, at that point, I guess they should be considered Italian-American. And also, just in these days, Luca Martera, who is he writes, he does research on different Italian-American themes. He just published a book on Harlem, which was a film, a propaganda film by the fascists about, how America is bad and how Italy is great. And it was very difficult to find this film. I know very little about. I know that he just published the book. There was a big press coverage in Italy, and I hope that the book is going to reach this side of the ocean, and then we can talk more about. But so thank you, Frank, and now I'll see you later.
Okay.
And now I ask Marcella to come. A native Italian, Calabrese, which is more important, and CUNY graduate center alumna, Marcella Bencivenni has been teaching history at Hostos since 2004. Her research focuses on the histories of immigration, labor, and social movements in the modern United States, with a particular interest in the Italian diaspora. She's the author of Italian Immigrant Radical Culture, the Idealism of Sovversivi in the United States, 1940, and co-editor of, which is NYU Press, so we are in the house, and co-editor of Radical Perspectives on Immigration, a special issue of the journal Socialism and Democracy, of which she is an editorial board member. And I have to say, your book is amazing. I enjoyed it. The audience should know that I am working on a documentary. I received a grant from the Russo Brother Foundation, Russo Brother Film Forum for Italian American Experience, to do on Italian theater at the end of 1800s, beginning of 1900s. So I'm reading a lot of books, and your book is so great of information, and is really exploring a world that is not explored often. And as we heard from Frank's presentation, there is a lack of political of talk about political issues in the Italian American, I will say, theater, movies, and this kind of. So let's say that is not explored so much. So my first question is for you, and we are going to have, just for the audience, we are going to have here and there our actors to read some of the pieces that we are going to talk about. So let me ask you, how the political theater started here in the United States with the Italians? In what kind of environment, and why they started?
Great. First of all, thank you, Laura, for having me here. I'm so delighted to see that my book is still generating interest, considering that at this point it's about 10 years old. So it's really great to know that it is still being considered, inspirational for some people. So let me start with the question of, where does this political theater fit? So my book really researches and explores what has been called the lost world of Italian American radicalism, right? This radical tradition that has always been there, but for some reason, it has not been discussed. It has not been, fleshed out until, about, I would say, the late 1980s, and then it really peaked by the end of the century. And so the theater is really part of this large culture, this broader culture that I call a radical culture, that in my view was essential to this movement that began to develop along with the political movement itself. So it's really a component of both the political movement and the culture that was fostered through this movement. And in my view, it's really, I was stunned when I began to do my research about the extent to which this theatrical culture was present, how vibrant it was, and how many plays actually were produced. So it is definitely a very important aspect of that radical movement and radical culture, which I speak about in my book. And in my view, together with the press, I would say that the theater was probably the most important element that both sustained the culture and that was a part of it. And so it really came, it produced, I think, naturally. I can't say there was a particular year when, this theater emerged. It really developed along with the radical communities, and it was really widespread. So just like immigrants began to settle in particular parts of the United States, most notably, of course, in New York, but also Chicago, Boston. Along with the immigrant communities began to emerge both these radical groups, and within these radical groups, this particular radical culture that was made of all these different components, of which the theater was a really important part. And the theater was used in a variety of ways, right? So, of course, there was a component of entertainment, right? Theater, in part, is meant to entertain, to amuse. But in the case of the political theater, of course, it also had a political mission. So the goal of these plays, for the most part, was to educate the immigrant worker, to really produce a political consciousness, and to, in some ways, to also familiarize them, the workers, with some of the main political themes, and in some cases, some of the political events. And so, for example, in the case of fascism, and we will talk about this, right? How the plays were used actually as a really powerful way to make Italian immigrants aware of the true brutality, of the true nature of fascism. But it was done in a dramatic way that even immigrants who were not familiar with the theory of fascism and the political, implications of, the fascist movement could really, in some ways, understand the basic message. So I would say, and then finally, there was another important aspect of the theater, which was fundraising. The plays became one of the most important way for these radical groups to fund themselves, to fund their groups, to fund their initiatives. And they were extremely successful. I mean, one thing probably that shocked me as I was conducting my research was to find out in the last page of the radical papers, they would often advertise the plays, but they would also give a report, detailed reports of how much money was a place generating. So they would literally, detail like the income that came from a play. And so I was able to estimate based on the cost of the ticket, which was usually between 5 and 10 cents, and it was always free to women and children. So another thing I want to say is that these plays were really seen as family events, and they were really important to, bring families together, communities together. And so, you realize that some of these plays had an audience between 300, 500 people in some big occasions like May Day. There were plays that were, hosted in big halls like People's House in New York, and they would have like 1,000 people. I mean, that's quite stunning, even for, today's, right? Like how many people go to see these plays? So there were many things that surprised me when I discovered, and of course, many of the plays have been lost, but some of them have survived.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in my research as well, it really, the beginning is seen with the circoli filodrammatici, so the amateurs that were doing theater to benefit, the earthquake in Italy or something, or the plague, moment of the plague. So it was, it was interesting. And they were doing, I don't know if they were doing political theater, but they were doing some Shakespeare, or even when Antonio Maiori, who was one of the major actor and producer of the time, impresario of the time, did his play Benvenuto Cellini, he had to move to a bigger theater, a 2,000 seats theater, because of the people. So, yeah. And considering that today you do fundraising to do a production, not to give money, I'm like, and one of the things that I always say is that we see, as Frank was saying before, the image of the Italian Americans are, the poor people coming, ignorant. So usually you don't think, they may go to see puppets, but they don't go to a political play. Instead, they were going to a political play, and they were really cheering and talking and be involved, and that is incredible. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about one of our compaesano, which is Alessandro Sciascia, who founded La Follia with his brother, mm-hmm. and he brought some plays. So let's talk one moment about Alessandro Sciascia, also known as, and you say it, and then I'll call our actors to do a little piece of.
Great.
writing.
So Alessandro Sciascia is perhaps better known as Riccardo Cordiferro. That was his pen name. That's how he signed his work. So as you mentioned, he was a Calabrese from a small town in the province of Cosenza, but he was really educated in Naples, where, interestingly enough, he was sent by his father to become a priest, and of course, after just a year, he was kicked out of the college because, he wasn't behaving apparently the way that the priests were expecting. And then, he had a sort of like very traditional education. So he came to the United States in the early 20th century to join his brother and father, who were already established in New York, and he had a fair education already. As you mentioned, they went on to found this wonderful literary weekly called La Follia, which was, as the name implies, quite satirical and, really successful. He sold, and he had a very long run. I think he stopped in the late 20s, but it was a very popular Italian language literary newspaper. So I want to also say that, Sciascia was incredibly productive. So he's best known for his plays, but he also wrote Neapolitan songs. He wrote 2 novels, and he gave, I believe, as many as 30 lectures, which is something that all this, I don't know where they found the time to do this, but this was, again, another very important aspect of this culture, that lectures, right? That the fact that they would host specific, presentation. They would give presentations on specific themes, and so he was one of the favorite of the Italian immigrant community.
We should name the very famous song he wrote.
Which one? Because he brought more than one.
The most famous is Cor Ingrato.
Cor Ingrato
was written by him. So
right. And, so I believe that some of them were written for Caruso later on, or at least were made famous by Caruso. But certainly, again, he was really an icon, if you want, a reference. He was the intellectual of the Italian immigrant community, but in a way that he could really relate to the community. And his plays are really incredible, in my view. They're not overtly political in the sense that they have an explicit socialist or anarchist message. But what is amazing about his plays is that they speak about problems and social issues that the immigrants could relate to. So he really speaks in his plays about the reality of being an Italian immigrant in a big city like New York City, and he really exposes, in many ways, the abuses that some of these immigrants, were victims of, and in some cases, the worst enemy of the Italian immigrant could be a compaesano, who would take advantage of the, the sense of loss of being, in a big city, not knowing the English. And so many Italian immigrants felt they had no choice but to really rely on these compaesani, and they would often find that they would be the one that would take advantage of them. And so many of his plays are an expose against the prominenti or the padroni, the bosses, but he's doing it in a very melodramatic fashion, which of course was very entertaining and really worked for the Italian immigrants. And so we can talk a little bit about some of his plays, but if you want to jump in, and
have the reading of Il Pezzente, which I find is from 1895.
Correct.
It's a long monologue. It's a man in prison, and he's telling his story. One thing I want to add is that Farfariello was also he came a little later, let's say, the fame was a little bit later, but Farfariello was the one also that talked in Edoardo Migliaccio, known as Farfariello. He did the macchette coloniali, these sketches where he was portraying the Italians in Little Italy. And he was portraying exactly what you were saying, you know, the Italians taking advantage of Italians, and or the Italian that loses a hand. It's like all the problems. He gets fired all the time because he finds horrible bosses. But in reading both of them, I find, you know, Farfariello was making people laughing, even though it is wonderful for us to read it now. But at that time, it was more entertaining. While when I read it Pezzente, and unfortunately, and then we'll talk about the fact that we don't have much document. I mean, we have some, but we don't have much. When I read it Pezzente, I can see like an empathy, I can see like a catharsis, as we say, you know, like a cathartic moment for the audience to see themselves there struggling and saying, yes, it's true. It's not my fault. If it's the fault of society, it's the fault of horrible.
Yeah, I mean, Il Pezzente is truly an indictment. It's an expose against the social inequality. I mean, what could be more, appropriate? I mean, it's the never-ending theme of, social inequality, social and economic inequality. And what's interesting is that, I mean, as you mentioned, it was really written early. I mean, it was written in 1895. It was published a year later. And, it sold 60,000 copies. I mean, these are, again, it's like, who's buying, like these are Italian immigrants who are not necessarily, wealthy, right? And yet they are buying, these books produced, written and produced by the local Italian immigrants. And so it's really, I think, a passionate expose against the poverty and the immorality of poverty. So, that the words that really resonate through this monologue, which, by the way, it's all in verses, so it's quite ambitious. And I think, I'm not a literary critic, but I believe it has some literary merit in itself. But again, what really stands out is this indignation, this really crying out against the immorality of poverty and the responsibility of society in letting that happen to some extent, right? And therefore against capitalism.
Yes, I see a question, but we'll finish for a moment with Cordifarra, and we'll come back to the question. Very interesting question. So let me ask Giacomo and Mario, are you there? You want to appear? Mario and Giacomo. So we'll leave you the stage. This is a very small excerpt from Il Pezzente. We can stay here. We can, be your audience, your live audience. It's a very short piece from the Il Pezzente. Giacomo will read the English and Mario the Italian. As you can hear, the Italian is very, very, very theatrical, very tragic, melodramatic. And in this moment, the man, the protagonist of the monologue, is in the prison and is telling us why is in there, who is the fault of his imprisonment. So, Giacomo.
In here, there are no criminals, no thieves. In here are the innocent and the unlucky, strong and open-hearted spirits, gallant, veteran of sacrosanct campaigns, apostles of sublime and beautiful ideas, and pure-souled warriors and rebels. In here, some of the finest of our youth are slowly worn away. The light of genius in vigorous and robust minds is spoiled and fades to feebleness. And if I live to see the day when I can have again the cherished freedom that I've lost, more precious than life itself, then I will bow my head before these walls in reverence and tell the world, the large of soul and the rebellious together are imprisoned here, condemned by this inhuman society. I'll say to everyone, I have the ugly name of criminal because you made me one. You heartless hypocrites who all refused to give me a penny and a bit of bread. You made me a criminal, every one of you, who laughed right in my face, insulting me, calling me tramp and scum.
Qui non vi sono i delinquenti, i ladri. Qui vi sono innocenti e disgraziati, anime forti e generose, baldi soldati di battaglie sacrosante, apostoli di idee belle e sublimi, ribelli e lottatori intemerati. Qui lentamente si consuma parte della migliore gioventù. L'ingegno qui si perde e si fiacca di cervelli robusti e vigorosi. E se avrò vita fino a quel dì che rivedrò l'amata libertà che ho perduta e che è preziosa più della vita nostra, riverente mi inchinerò dinanzi a queste mura e dirò a tutti: qui vi stan rinchiusi i generosi ed i ribelli insieme che la inumana società condanna. Sì, voglio dire a tutti: il brutto nome di delinquente io l'ho, perché voi stessi tal mi faceste, o ipocriti, o crudeli che mi negaste un soldo e un po' di pane. Voi mi faceste delinquente, voi che mi rideste in faccia e mi insultaste chiamandomi straccione.
Well, this is only me, but it's the entire. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I'll see you in a little while. Thank you, Marcella. So I let me read the question because it could be related to this. Mm-hmm. So John Lauro is asking us, Marcella, did you find that the radical movement tended to come from newer immigrants who brought the radical ideas from Italy, but that over time radicalization found little energy in the larger Italian American community that tried desperately to assimilate and succeed economically? So this piece is very, very strong. And we're going to have some strong pieces during the fascism, later on, let's say. But can we say something about
Sure.
Can we answer?
So first of all, thank you for this question. I would say that yes and no. It's my short answer to a very complicated question. Yes, in the sense that many of these Sovversivi, these radicals, came to the United States with an experience already in Italy of radical movement, whether they would be socialist or anarchist or social democracy. They had some kind of exposure. But it is also true that especially for the immigrants themselves, so that many became radicalized actually in the United States. And what radicalized them was, in some ways, the disillusionment with America. Many came here with this image, right, of the United States as a promised land. And when they confronted the economic exploitation, the horrible conditions, both in terms of work, but also in terms of housing. For many of them, it was truly, a myth that crumbled in front of their eyes. And so there was also a component of radicalization that was actually caused by the experience in the United States. What you are referring to in terms of assimilation happens really much later, and it really happens for both internal and external reasons. The internal one being fascism, right, and World War I, and the external one being the really pressure on the part of the United States to assimilate immigrants, not just Italians, by the way, on the basis of what were perceived the mainstream American values, and of course the idea also of whiteness, which we can discuss here, but it really is also an important question. So I would say that until World War II, this radical culture is very alive, and is still alive even with the children of Italian immigrants, like second generation. It's really after World War II that we have this sort of like distancing from the radical past. And if anything, the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti in 1927 really captures what it meant for it. That execution translated for Italian immigrants into the message that you cannot be a good American and a radical at the same time. And many of them began to distance themselves to protect their children, but also out of fear that they might be deported or that they might be exposed. And that's really what, in some ways, killed the movement. And again, as I said, it's not confined to Italian Americans.
But one thing that I noticed in my research, I've also in the past few years talking with friends, I have a friend who is Italian American who found in his attic something that his great uncle wrote, and it was like some plays that were really about, very melodramatic about the condition of life. And it seems that this person was paid to go lecturing around in anarchist clubs. And they found this in attics. So I wonder if you think that there was a myth, because I know that there are a lot of anarchist socialists, they travel a lot from Italy to America and back and forth. So you think that here there was a big movement, or it was a bigger movement than the one that was in Italy? Was bigger here or was bigger in
well, I think, bigger has to be put within the context of like, what are we comparing it to? When I say, radicalism was never, representative of, the overwhelming majority of Italian immigrants, but that's true for, again, not just for Italian Americans, that's true for any, group really. But I would basically say that it was an important minority. And we also have to distinguish between the so-called leaders of the movement, right? The true radicals, the one that were really invested, the one that were in some ways creating the movement, and the people who were rank and file. And, but, if, again, numbers are any indication, there is a wonderful archive in the state of Rome, the Archivio di Stato in Rome, that has actually files on all Sovversivi, all immigrants who were perceived by the Italian state as radicals. And they were essentially spied on, by Italian consuls, the embassy, that would provide information on their actions. And for the one who were active in the United States, there are basically about 6,000 folders, specific files that are just relative to Italian immigrants who were active in the radical movement in the United States. Now, keep in mind that eventually we're talking about 4 million, immigrants settling in the United States. About 50% return to Italy after World War I. So again, 6,000 is not, does not necessarily mean everybody, but nevertheless, I think it is an important, number, because those are people that the Italian state was actually concerned about and was, watching very carefully. So clearly there was a movement, right? And it wasn't bigger than in Italy, and I also want to say one thing. I know that we are running out of time, as often happens, but the radical movement, the Italian radical movement, and radical movements of that period in general really are best understood as diasporic movement. And just as Laura was referring to, many of these radical leaders really moved from one place to the other. And, sometimes they went back to Italy, then they came back to the United States, and they really followed political movements on both sides of the ocean. So that transnational component is really, really important to understand this movement.
Interesting in a time where traveling was so, it was not easy like today. So let's, there is another question that I'm going to keep for last, because it really needs to be asked not only to you, but also I want to ask Frank about this question. Anyway, let's move on. So the other, we have other writers. We have Pietro Gori, is that right? Mm-hmm. Who wrote, what is it? It was L'inno del Primo Maggio, right?
Primo Maggio, Gente Onesta, Senza Patria.
Yeah, it's difficult to find that. There is L'inno del Primo Maggio. I say to the audience, you can find it online, because you can find the song, but the actual one act is impossible to find. And then we have, so Pietro Gori, what years we are talking about?
Pietro Gori is probably one of the most important Italian anarchists, theorist of anarchy. He wrote the body of his work is late 19th century, early 20th century. So, Primo Maggio was written, I believe, in 1895. Most of his works are within the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And they were, again, incredibly popular. And, I want to say actually something when we were talking about literacy. We often, again, have this idea of the immigrants, and Italian immigrants in particular, as illiterate, as ignorant. And to some extent, of course, that's true, right? They were contadini. However, we often think of literacy in a very narrow way as the ability of people to read and write. But, many of these peasants could recite by heart entire operas, and they could memorize, plays. And, so again, it's like we have lost that skill. But for them, it was very common to be educated in a way in which they just remembered, right? They memorized, things. So they were, and the theater was very important in that sense, right? Like they were very familiar with classics.
The theaters here in New York were in Lower Manhattan, and also New Jersey, right?
Yes, I mean the Filodrammatiche Rosse, this radical theater group that were associated with these anarchist socialist groups were really spread throughout. I mean, Boston, Paterson, New Jersey. They were available. There were some in Illinois, in the mines, where there were also strong Italian communities. They were really anywhere, wherever Italians settled, there would be pretty much a radical group, and along with the radical group, there would be the radical theater, the radical newspaper, the radical orchestra, and the radical picnic. I mean, it was really a subculture, and a very rich and vibrant and alive one.
So after Pietro Gori, we have, I don't know if we want to talk already about Bachirka,
Vincenzo,
and Giovannitti. They're like...
Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief because, I know I really want to hear the actors because, the reading of Il Pezzente, I didn't get a chance to say it, but it was phenomenal. They did, I want to just say that they did an amazing job, and it's a very short synopsis of the monologue, but it was very well done. I
have to do that first.
There are, again, many plays we could focus on and many playwrights that we could pick. Vincenzo Bachirka is very interesting because his plays have to do with fascism, or better, with a critique of fascism. He was a socialist deputy who actually, again, is very typical of that diasporic radical that I'm talking about. He left Italy, he went to Brazil, then from Brazil to Argentina, then he comes to the United States. He stays in the United States, I believe, from 1908 to about World War I. Then he goes back to Italy, is elected, and that's, as a socialist deputy. But then with the rise of fascism, he comes back to the United States as an anti-fascist. So in the 1920s, Bachirka is really the voice, among others, these radicals, but he's really the voice of anti-fascism. And again, like many of these Sovversivi, in addition to give lectures, in addition to writing articles about the true nature of fascism, he also used, literary mediums, in this case, the theater, to reach out the largest number possible of Italian Americans. And so I was able to find the script of La Madre, which is the title of this play that he writes, I believe, in 1928. And what's nice about La Madre is that it's really, as the title suggests, it's a place that looks at the horror of fascism through the eyes of a mother who is confronted with a family that is being literally, broken apart from the rise of this movement. Why? Because she has one son who is a very, strong anti-fascist, but the youngest son has been, if you want, corrupted by the rhetoric of fascism and has become a black shirt. And so the drama is really about these two brothers who are now enemies, as a result of different political ideologies. And then at the end of the play, the youngest brother commits suicide when he understands that, his actions were wrong, and when he discovers essentially what fascism really was about. And it's, again, a very melodramatic, play, but the message is clear. The message is political. It was meant to show Italian immigrants who, like the younger brother, right, in the play, has been in some ways brainwashed, or in some ways really unable, for a variety of reasons, to understand what fascism is truly about. And to it's kind of like a warning, play to say, look, this is really what fascism is, and it's really dehumanizing. And Giovannitti did that too in some of his plays that he published, but with respect to the dehumanization of war. So Giovannitti's plays, who was, probably the most important poet, in Italian America, his plays are all anti-war plays. And so he wrote plays only during the World War I period, and all of them are essentially, again, an exploration and very psychological investigation on the dehumanizing effects of the war. So, I'll stop here.
We can have. So we have. We call back Giacomo and Mario. So we have a scene from La Madre. Pietro and Giorgio. I think Pietro is the other brother, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so Pietro is the anti-fascist, basically. And then after that, so this very brief scene, very brief, is only in Italian. It is brief because it's only in Italian. And then we're going to, after that, Giacomo is reading the English version and Mario the Italian version of a Mussolini, which is a very brief poet by Giovannitti, which I loved it because it reminds me of someone. That's it. Thank you, guys. We'll start with Madre.
Che c'è?
C'è che non se ne può più.
Lo so.
Mi mandano i compagni a chiederti consiglio.
Consiglio su che?
Su quel che bisogna fare.
L'ho detto 1000 volte. Resistere. Non sbandarsi, non scoraggiarsi, aspettare. Verrà la nostra ora. Questo carnevale sanguinario non può essere eterno.
Ma per farlo finire occorre che cominciamo noi.
Cominciare? Che cosa? Come?
La rivolta.
La rivolta? Merone, in quanti siamo? Quali armi abbiamo? Quali collegamenti ci sono fra le varie città? La rivolta oggi è la follia.
Tutte le rivolte sembrano follia, finché non ebbero successo. Io credo che il dolore è tanto e l'odio brucia in tanti cuori che basterà un cenno, un inizio qualsiasi perché avvenga la grande esplosione.
Oggi la rivolta sarebbe gettare in pasto alla fiera armata, potente, organizzata, le nostre eroiche pattuglie. Un massacro, nulla più.
Ma che importa essere anche massacrati a mucchi se ci assassinano a uno?
Non si tratta delle nostre persone. È la causa che non dobbiamo perdere di vista. Al suo trionfo dobbiamo sacrificare anche le nostre generose impazienze.
Fuggire così. Mm-hmm.
Sì, per i tetti come un ladro.
Non ci hai detto che bisogna sapere attendere e non accettare le provocazioni del nemico sino a che non riteniamo l'ora matura per attaccare.
Thank you. And now, so this was again a little scene from between Pietro. Mario, come back because we're doing Mussolini. So a little, Mario was Giorgio, and Giacomo was Pietro, and was about talking about it. It's beautiful also the language because it's really intense. I don't know how to explain. And now a Mussolini by Giovannitti.
To Mussolini. A man may lose his soul for just one day of splendor, and be still accounted wise, or he may waste his life in a disguise, like kings and priests and jesters, and still may be saved and held a hero if the play is all he knew. But what of him who tries with truth and fails, and then wins fame with lies? How shall he know what history will say? By this: no man is great who does not find a poet who will hail him as he is with an almighty song that will unbind through his exploits eternal silences. Duce, where is your bard? In all mankind, the only poem you inspired is this.
A Mussolini. Può un uomo perder l'alma per un'ora di splendore e passar per arsennato, o sciupar la vita mascherato da re, prete, buffone e andar di prora e aver chi per eroe lo tenga ancora, pur se una parte ha bene recitato. Ma che posto la storia ha destinato per chi la fama a suon d'inganni implora? Ecco, mai uomo è grande se non trova poeta che l'acclami com'è e, onesto, con un canto possente ne rimuova dell'eterno silenzio il velo mesto. Dov'è il tuo bardo, Duce? A tutta prova, il sol poema che ha ispirato è questo.
Fantastic. I'm going to have Giacomo back. No, ragazzi, come back. Giacomo, Marcella, Mario. I just want to ask the actors, how do you find the language? How do you find the reading of these plays? Do you find it that they're like they feel the time, or they're very actual?
Well, the Pezzente, I thought it was, it's an eternal struggle. Is it really a crime to be poor? It's an old recurring theme of society and history, and I thought that the clarity with which he made his point was very well stated, and echoed a lot of the political battles that we hear today. Maybe not necessarily coming from the Italian community, but basically all sort of class struggle, whether it comes from a minority or a class of workers. It's a recurring theme. I shouldn't be guilty for being born in this condition that you keep enforcing, with your policies. So definitely very, very modern and worth listening to, I think.
Mario?
Oh, let's say the language is very powerful. It's something that doesn't belong to me right now, but I feel that it's part of me. Because, it doesn't matter how you share your feeling, but, Italian is a very powerful language and gives me a chance to put a different color. And I feel much more, when I read something in Italian, I feel much more than English, of course, because I'm Italian, but because, it's something related to my past, something related to my story. It's something relating to my family. It's something relating to me as a person. So there is no time. I mean, I would love if I could express myself using those words this way, but I know that for the rest of people, maybe I can just be considered like a crazy person because nobody speaks like that anymore. even if the ideas are very, very powerful, and maybe we should just, of course, study the past to avoid, mistakes that we did before, and hopefully we're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to make any more in the future. But it's great. I feel like sort of an emotional thing, when I was reading, because it's beautiful.
So thank you, guys. Applause. Really. Thank you so much. And I want to also call Frank, if he's somewhere. Oh, hi.
Hi.
So, unmute Marcella. Marcella, what, just to explain a little bit to the audience, what is these two pieces? The Mussolini was a satirical, kind of a satirical, I don't know, I don't want to say maybe not satirical, but there was irony in it. Do you suggest other authors, other plays?
Mm-hmm. So this is actually going back to Frank's question, right, about fascism or anti-fascist plays written by Italian Americans. And so these are Italian immigrants living in America, but many of them, I would say, had made a choice to stay in America. So I don't know at what point, we use the term Italian American consciously, if it is only for second generation, third generation. But definitely, for example, Giovannitti to me is someone that I would describe as Italian American by the time he dies in 1958. So there is, again, a real anti-fascist culture and movement that it's emerging from this radical movement. So Giovannitti is one of these anti-fascists, very, very active, along with Bachirka. There are also many in the anarchist cadre. And so there is one, for example, player, Virgilio Gozzoli, who was active in the Bronx. And he wrote a beautiful play, anti-fascist play called Il Cancro, right? So he uses the metaphor of cancer to describe fascism. And he wrote a couple of other plays. I can't remember the title anymore, but again, these were well known within the anarchist circles of New York. And he was a little bit later. We're talking about the early 40s and mid 40s for Gozzoli. The problem, of course, is that there is probably more out there. I was able to explore and to discuss in my books only the plays that I actually was able to recover the text. The Immigration History Research Center in Minneapolis was my, the place that really allowed me to write this book. Because, for example, all the plays by Coldiferro, Alessandro Sisca, are preserved there. And so you can read the manuscript. And they are a wonderful, wonderful research institution. I can't say well enough about that archive, but many others have been lost. Others that I was able to find were published in the Italian American Radical Press, so Italian language radical papers published in the United States. For example, Giovannitti published altogether, wrote 7 plays. Com'era nel principio, as it was in the beginning, was the most successful one. It even had a run in Broadway in 1915, one time only, but it was, I found the record that it was, produced for just one day in Broadway, great acclaim. It was an anti-war play, but he also wrote 6 additional plays, but they were all published as one act in the newspapers that publish them. So in the case of 3 of his plays were in Il Fuoco, which was a literary magazine that he co-founded and produced with Onorio Ruotolo, very famous sculptor in the Italian immigrant community. So again, and one of my biggest regrets was that I wasn't able to find a text written by an Italian-American radical woman. Because again, there were women who were active in these radical movements, and unlike poetry where I was able to find the text of Italian radical women, Bachirka's wife, Clara Bachirka, wrote a beautiful novel, radical novel, that I talk about also in my book, but I wasn't able to find any play that survived that was penned by an Italian immigrant woman. And I wish I was able, because I know that there must be some. And I can say, though, that women were very active in the radical theater as actresses. And that was another interesting aspect of this radical theater that gave women an opportunity to be public in a way in which traditional Italian women could not. And so, for example, Sacco's wife, Rosina, was very well known as an actress. And he writes about being proud of the fact that his wife was this well-recognized actress. And so it was a way in which women, particularly the partners of radical men, contributed to the radical cause by organizing this event, sometimes acting in the plays or fundraising. And of course, as participants, because these were one of the few venues where women attended, right, along with the men. Why? Because they could bring their kids with them.
Oh, that's true. So I have a question. Also, there is a hand raised by Marianne. Marianne, if you want to talk, if you want to say something, put it in the Q&A. If you hear me. The question that I want to ask, well, I would say Marcella and Frank, about the Giacomo and Mari. If you want to say something, you just tell me. So what happened that turned so many descendants of Italian immigrants into violent anti-immigrants now?
Oh my God. I ask myself that all the time because most of my family are anti-immigrant. And I came into this world into an immigrant family that were anti-immigrant. I think they drank the Kool-Aid, honestly. I think that so many emigrated to the United States with this hope that their lives would not only get better, because they saw that in the movies, but they would somehow flourish. And when it didn't happen, it's kind of like Nathaniel West Day of the Locust. When it didn't happen, they needed somebody to blame. So, they were forced into assimilation. So many of Italian Americans were forced into assimilation. And now, because their ancestors were bullied into assimilation, I know my mother was, anyone who threatens their way of life, their quest for the American dream, which doesn't fucking exist, they have to kind of squash. So Trump and the Republican propaganda machine say to blame immigrants, just like Putin says to blame gays and lesbians. So they go after immigrants. I don't know. That's one of my explanations. Marcella.
Yes.
Well, again, as an historian, I tend to be a little bit more, I think these are really complex questions. So I tend to avoid the generalizations because that's often how we get in trouble. I also want to say one thing, that the problem of anti-immigration feelings is I don't think it's limited to either Italian Americans within the United States. So I think there are also other immigrant groups who have embraced, nativism, but it's also, and perhaps more disturbingly, it's also very alive in Italy. So Italians have turned into, in some cases, quite, if you consider that in Italy, children of immigrants who have lived the entire life in Italy, right, are still not considered the citizens of Italy. So my son, who was born in the United States, is automatically a citizen of Italy by virtue of the fact that I am Italian by birth. However, a child of one immigrant in Italy who was born in Italy and knows no other country but Italy, so speaks Italian, went to school in Italy, has never been outside of Italy, is in this limbo until they are at the age of 18 and they have to apply for citizenship. And so there has been a huge movement around this. I'm digressing, but the point I'm trying to make is that, again, the problem with the anti-immigration feelings has to do with very specific historic reasons. And yes, the immigrants is often the easy target to blame for both political reasons and sometimes for the pressure of belonging. And in the case of Italian Americans, I really think that is, at the end, the result, right? So the experience of Italian Americans, I often say more about actually America than it says about, the Italian immigrant experience, in the sense that, again, it's this desire to be an America and what it means to be an America, and who defines, what it means to be in America. And now we are really in an historic moment where all of this is really being contested and redefined, not just by scholars, right, but also young people. Schools are revamping curriculum. I mean, at CUNY, we are now doing a Black race ethnic initiative that is really trying to reassess the entire curriculum at CUNY and how we think about these issues. So I think there are great opportunities, and that's why, Frank, your work is so important, because you can really, your work can resonate with, third, fourth generation Italian Americans in a way that my work probably can't. And so I loved this kind of, the fact that we brought both the present and the past into this discussion. But I think Giacomo wanted to say something, so I'll
then
mute
we have
myself.
to prepare.
Yes, I meant to share just a little point of view. I'm an immigrant myself. I've been in this country for over 12 years now, and it's not quite half of my life, but we're getting there. So it's an interesting moment for me as I explore my identity. And one thing I like to share with my fellow friends who are not maybe Italian or are not familiar with Italian culture. Well, one thing that is interesting of the distortion, the distorted idea that Italians might still today have of America, it was certainly for me growing up, was that we consume enormous amounts of American products from TV, movies. Personally, I grew up idolizing American movies, and I still love them. So don't get it wrong. But one thing that really made a change in my perception once I got here was that we watch all these movies dubbed in Italian, and all characters, they sound exactly the same. So you have the white American waspy kind of person next to the Black person, Asian person. They all sound exactly the same. So we have this idea of America, of this beautiful diverse, multicultural country where, you know, everybody's on the same level and their voice has the same power and importance and impact on society. And then, and so you're like, I want to be part of that. Like, you know, at least that was my case. You know, I always loved, I'm proud of my Italian heritage, but I always felt this need to expand. And once I got here, I realized that we're not mixed. A lot of people lived this adventure of coming to this unknown land full of different cultures that sometimes had to clash with each other. And you know, so you forced to whatever you have, that it's, you know, that makes sense for you, you know, and your religion. There's an incredible and emphasis on religion in this country that I didn't understand until I got here, and I was like, oh, it's what keeps you afloat among everybody else. It tells you who you are. So I feel like, in a sense, for some Italian people who came here, I feel like they really did find something different from what they had in mind. And once the, you know, the competition started coming in, then it becomes a thing of like, you know, I want to hold on to whatever I have, and, you know, stay there. I don't want you here. Well, it's been so tough.
It's a very interesting, as Marcella says, is a very complicated or very long, because also for me, being here for 25 years and working a lot with Italian Americans, I really echo Frank, and we talk many times about the fact that Italian Americans seems that they don't like to talk about themselves. There is like this kind of not wanted to explore their history unless it's a certain kind of history. And I know that in the audience we have some of our friends that explore and write about Italian. They're Italian American. They write about Italian Americans. They even write plays that are not produced yet. They are not out yet, but about Italian Americans. And so it's an interesting thing. And the very last question, then I promise I finish. I will stay here forever. I love this conversation. But do you think that, Marcella, at the time, because in my research, again, for the documentary, and you will see the actors in the documentaries as well, is that they were performing, for instance, Shakespeare in Italian and Yiddish in the same theater, in the same set, one night Italian, one night Yiddish, and it feels like they were joining forces. Were they really collaborating? They were really working together, or they were Italian with Italians and the others with the others?
So are you asking if they were collaborating in terms of like producing plays?
There was an assimilation with the other population or not?
The Italian immigrant community was very insular, for a variety of reasons. They obviously shared the spaces, right? And so for Italians in New York, of course, the most obvious comparison is, the Jews, because they shared literally the same neighborhood in the Lower East Side. And there were, in some cases, opportunities where they worked together, like the garment factories is another example of, places that were prevalently Italian and Jewish. And then there were others where they coexisted with other groups. For example, we often don't think about this, but Italians had worked and lived, for example, in New Orleans, along with African Americans, for a long part of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, again, in part because those were the only areas they could afford or that they would be allowed to settle. But there weren't, in the realm of politics, there were, causes like, movements where definitely there were ethnic alliances, and fascism again would be the best example of how Italian Americans managed to bring in other people to join their anti-fascist cause in their, for example, rallies and demonstrations. Yes, it was prevalently Italian immigrants, Italian Americans, but they would often get someone who spoke in Yiddish or spoke in English to also deliver the message, the same message in another language. In terms of the theater, what they did, they all rented out these big, halls. So the People's House in New York City, which I believe is Webster Hall, it was transformed into that very famous Webster Hall.
One was Webster Hall, yes.
That's a place that was shared by, a lot of socialists, a lot of labor unions and groups. And so it could be used for a play, but also for a big lecture or a political event.
They were all called hall or assembly rooms. So they were like,
but, most of these plays were, in Italian, there are really no English translation of this. Arturo Giovannitti is the only one play I know of that, though was written originally in Italian, had this one-time run in Broadway in English. But for the most part, and, again, Giovannitti was very versatile in both English, Italian, actually spoke French as well, and he really navigated very comfortably both the American and the Italian, world. So he's sort of exceptional, along with probably Carlo Tresca. They were the two sort of like Italian radicals that were very well known both within the Italian immigrant community, but also outside of those communities.
And we didn't talk about Carlo Tresca, but another time. There is so much to say. So I want to thank all of you, Giacomo Rocchini, Mario Merone, for being wonderful actors, and Marcella Bencivenni. Get this book if you don't have it.
I'm not paying Laura, by the way, to say, thank you, Frank. You guys are amazing.
Yes, and thank you, Frank. Well, yes, I gave it to Frank because I said, you should read this book. I know that he's going to love it, and maybe he's going to have an inspiration. So we'll talk again about, as you all know, we are doing this series about Italian theater, Italian American theater, and world theater every year. Maybe, Frank, who knows, let's hope that we're going to have more Italian American plays on some Italian American experience.
We need it.
Yes, we need it. And it was very interesting to see that, most of the Italian American plays are written by not Italian, which is something, maybe next time I have a therapist here to and understand why. Anyway, thank you, Julian, who is in the backstage, and thank you, Casa, as usual, and we'll see you soon somewhere.
And I want to just say a shout out to all the people who attended. I recognized a couple of friends, and so including a dear friend from Italy, Claudia, ciao. And I see a colleague from Hostos, so I just wanted to acknowledge them and say thank you. I appreciate your presence.
And I'd like to thank you, Laura, for putting this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And it will be soon. It will be online, so you can watch it again, and then you will watch our documentary and Frank film. Thank you.
Giacomo and Mario, thank you again. Your performance was just like beautiful. You really made a wonderful job with those few lines, but so well done.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.